The snow wasn't just falling, it was coming down with a purpose. Heavy, wet flakes sticking to the pines and burying the world in a thick, white silence. Out on the Rollins Ranch, you learn that a storm isn't just weather. It's a predator. It waits for you to make one wrong move, to run low on wood, to lose your nerve. The wind screamed like something dying out past the timberline, rattling the bones of the little log house that stood defiant against the wilderness. Inside, Jacob Rollins was trying to mend a strap, but his mind wasn't on the leather. His hands, hard and calloused from a life of breaking things and trying to fix them, moved on their own. He was 38, but the silence in his soul was ancient. 4 winters ago, he'd buried his wife, Sarah, and a part of himself right along with her. Now it was just him and the boys, trying to survive in a land that didn't care if they did. His sons were quiet. Toby, 9 years old with his mother's serious eyes, was sharpening a stick into a fine point. Will, the 7-year-old, had their mother's Bible open, his little finger tracing words he couldn't quite read, his voice a low whisper in the crackling quiet. Jacob had chosen this isolation, miles from any neighbor, just him, his boys, and the ghosts that clung to the rafters. He thought quiet meant safe. He was wrong. Just as the last light bled from the sky, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. A knock. It wasn't a strong knock. It was faint, unsteady, like a bird hitting the glass. Jacob's head snapped up. His hand, without a thought, went to the Winchester rifle hanging by the door. The boys froze, their eyes wide and fixed on him. The knock came again, followed by a scraping sound. The sound of a body giving up, sliding down the rough wood of his door. He cracked the door open an inch. A fist of Arctic air punched him in the face, and there, illuminated by the flickering lantern light, was a woman. She was barefoot in the snow. Her shawl was so thin it was more of a prayer than a piece of clothing. Her dark hair was matted with ice, and her skin was the color of bone. But her eyes were still fighting. She swayed on her feet, lips blue and cracked. Her voice was a ghost of a sound, a frozen whisper. "Let me stay," she rasped. "I'll take care of your children." And then her eyes rolled back, and she fell. Jacob caught her before she hit the porch. She weighed nothing. A bundle of sticks and frozen desperation. Every instinct, every hard lesson this land had taught him, screamed to shut the door. A stranger in a storm was a risk you didn't take. You just don't. But then Toby was at his side, his small voice cutting through the noise in Jacob's head. "Pa," he said, his voice trembling, "she's gonna die." And that was it. He carried her inside, laying her on the bench by the fire. The smell of wet wool and cold filled the cabin. Her feet were a mess. Raw, blue, the skin split open. He grabbed old rags and started rubbing them, trying to force life back into them. She let out a low moan but didn't wake. Toby brought a thick wool blanket, and Will, bless his heart, put the kettle on the stove. "Don't get too close," Jacob grunted, but the warning had no teeth. The boys hovered, their faces a mixture of fear and a strange, forgotten thing. Fascination. He pulled the wet shawl off her. Her dress underneath was torn and thin. No boots, no gloves, no bag, nothing. She had walked into the jaws of a blizzard with absolutely nothing. "Who does that, Pa?" Will whispered, his eyes huge. "What did she say before she fell?" Toby asked. Jacob stared into the fire, the woman's words echoing in his head. "I'll take care of your children." It was a strange promise from a woman who couldn't even take care of herself. An hour crawled by. The stranger's breathing evened out. The blue in her fingertips started to fade, replaced by a faint, hopeful pink. Jacob sat in his chair, the Winchester now resting against his leg. He didn't trust her, not one bit. This wasn't charity. This was a mystery, and mysteries out here usually ended in blood. Toby broke the silence. "She can have Ma's room, can't she?" Jacob's gaze turned to steel. "No one uses that room." Toby looked down, biting his lip. Will came over, pressing a cup of warm milk into Jacob's hand. He didn't ask again. Around midnight, her eyelids fluttered open. She looked around, panicked, like a cornered animal. Her eyes darted around the cabin before landing on the two boys, asleep in their bedrolls by the fire. A strange softness crept into her expression. Jacob leaned forward. "You got a name?" She hesitated, her throat working. "Mara." "Where'd you come from, Mara?" Her voice was raw, like tearing canvas. "Sundown Ridge." Jacob did the math in his head. "That's 20 miles, through a blizzard." She just nodded. They, they took my things. Said I wasn't worth the food to keep me." "Who's they?" Jacob pressed. Silence. She just stared into the fire. Finally, she looked back at him, her eyes holding a darkness that had nothing to do with the night. "The men who run that town. They don't like people who ask questions." She looked close to death, but her gaze was sharp. There was a story here, and Jacob had a gut feeling it was one he didn't want to bring under his roof. But he had. He stood up, pulling his coat tighter. "You're safe for the night, Mara. In the morning, you tell me the real story, not the one you think I want to hear." He banked the fire and watched his boys sleep. He didn't sleep a wink. He sat in his chair, rifle in his lap, listening to the storm outside and the quiet breathing of the woman inside. And he couldn't shake her words. Not a plea for help, not a request for shelter. It was a promise. Or maybe it was a warning. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving the world scoured clean and blindingly white. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Mara was awake, sitting up by the fire, her movements slow and deliberate. She'd found an old shirt of his late wife's and put it on. It hung off her small frame, clean but faded, like a memory. Her feet were swollen and ugly, but she was alive. Jacob was already working, his hands needing the familiar comfort of an axe handle. But he could feel her eyes on him. When he came back inside, the smell of something other than boiled beans and stale bread filled the air. She'd found a small pouch of herbs in her pocket and had made a weak, fragrant tea. She was already making her mark. Will, ever the brave one, walked right up to her. "Why did you say you'd take care of us?" Mara looked from Will to Jacob, her expression unreadable. "Because I know what it's like to have no one." It was a good answer. Maybe too good. Later, while the boys were outside checking the chicken coop, Jacob sat down across from her. The time for games was over. "Sundown Ridge," he said, his voice flat. "That's mining country, run by a man named Elias Thorne. He's not a man who just casts people out. He buries them." Mara didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her tea. "I was a bookkeeper for him." Jacob's eyebrows shot up. A bookkeeper. Not a teacher at a mission. The first lie. And I saw things. Numbers that didn't add up. Names on a payroll for men who were already in the ground. Payments for services. She looked him dead in the eye. "Thorne is skimming from his own mines, and he's paying men to make sure nobody finds out." Jacob felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was worse than he thought. This wasn't a beggar. This was a witness. A loose end. "So you ran?" "I did more than run," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She reached into the folds of her torn dress and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. It was thin, compact, but Jacob knew it was a death sentence. "I took the proof." "Holy hell." He stared at the book, then at her. The barefoot woman in the snow wasn't a victim. She was a fighter, and she had just brought a war to his doorstep. "You have any idea what you've done?" he growled. "Thorne will tear this country apart looking for that book. For you." "I know," she said calmly. "That's why I came here." Jacob froze. "What do you mean you came here?" Her gaze was steady, intense. "I didn't just wander in the snow, Jacob. I was looking for this ranch. I was looking for you." The floor seemed to drop out from under him. The quiet life he'd built, the isolation he'd thought was a fortress. It was all a lie. The storm hadn't brought her to him by chance. She had been a key, turning a lock he didn't even know was on his door. And now he had to wonder, what kind of door had she just unlocked? Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Mara clutched the little black book to her chest. "Because before I worked for Elias Thorne, I searched for information. About men who used to work for him, men who left, men who knew his secrets and managed to walk away." Her eyes bored into him. There weren't many. In fact, there was only one. The air in the cabin turned to ice. The past Jacob had buried 4 years ago, buried right alongside his wife, was clawing its way back to the surface. He had never been a simple rancher. Before Sarah, before the boys, he had been something else. He had been Thorne's right hand, the man who collected the debts, the man who made problems disappear. He had walked away thinking he was free. He had been a fool. "You're lying," he snarled, but the words tasted like ash. "Am I?" she challenged. "I know about the payrolls, Jacob, and I saw your name on the old ones from 5 years back. Jacob Rollins, Special Services. You weren't just a guard. You were his enforcer." He shot to his feet, the chair scraping violently against the wood floor. "You will not speak of this again. Not in this house." The boys, they couldn't know. They could never know the man their father used to be. Mara stood too, unafraid. "I didn't come here to threaten you, Jacob. I came here for help. Thorne doesn't just want the ledger back. He wants me dead. He sent men after me. His lead tracker, a man named Cole Renair." Jacob's blood ran cold. Cole, vicious, relentless. A man who enjoyed his work. If Cole was hunting her, she wouldn't have made it another 5 miles. "They cornered me near the river," Mara continued, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "I had to jump. I lost everything, my horse, my supplies. I thought I was dead, but I remembered the maps. I remembered your name, a ranch at the edge of nowhere. I walked for 2 days, hoping, praying you were the man who got away, that you'd have a reason to hate Thorne as much as I do." He stared at her, a whirlwind of anger, fear, and a terrifying sense of inevitability churning inside him. She hadn't just brought trouble. She had brought his entire past crashing down on them. Suddenly, the reason for his wife's death felt thinner. They'd said it was a fever, swift and brutal, but Sarah had always been strong. She'd always hated his connection to Thorne. She'd been the reason he'd left. Had she asked too many questions? Pushed too hard? Was the fever just a story he'd been told? A story he'd wanted to believe? The silence was shattered by Toby's voice from the doorway. "Pa, who's Cole Renair?" Jacob and Mara spun around. The boys stood there, their faces pale, having heard everything. The secret was out. The walls of his quiet life had just been breached, not from the outside, but from within. Before he could answer, another sound came from outside, the distinct, rhythmic crunch of multiple horses walking through deep snow. Headed directly for the cabin. They were here. Mara's face went white. "It's him. It's Cole." There was no time, no escape. The war she'd started hadn't just come to his doorstep. It was about to kick it down. "Get in the cellar," Jacob commanded, his voice a low growl. He grabbed the Winchester, his movements fluid and practiced, the muscle memory of his old life taking over. "Now!" He ripped the bearskin rug off the floor, revealing the heavy wooden trap door beneath. Toby and Will scrambled down the ladder into the cold dark without a word, their eyes wide with a terror that tore at Jacob's soul. Mara hesitated, clutching the ledger. "Jacob, they'll kill you. They'll kill all of us if they find you here with that book," he snapped. "Give it to me." She looked at the ledger, then at him, her eyes searching his. She handed it over. Jacob shoved the small book into a hidden pocket inside his coat. "Get down there. No matter what you hear, you don't make a sound. You don't come out. Understand?" She nodded, her face grim, and disappeared into the darkness. Jacob slammed the trapdoor shut, threw the rug back over it, and kicked a wooden crate on top for good measure. He took a deep breath, forcing the violent tremor in his hands to stop. He was no longer Jacob Rollins, grieving rancher. He was the man Elias Thorne used to send into the storm. He opened the cabin door just as 3 riders pulled up. The man in the lead was Cole Renair. He had a big, meaty face and eyes as dead and cold as a frozen lake. The man was a shark who'd learned to walk on land. "Rollins?" Cole grunted, his lips pulling back in a sneer that wasn't a smile. "Long time. Place looks quiet." "It is," Jacob said, his hand resting casually on the stock of his rifle. "I like it that way." I'm sure you do, Cole said, his eyes scanning the property, missing nothing. We're tracking a thief. A little half-Apache girl stole something from Mr. Thorne. We tracked her this far, then the storm wiped her trail. You seen anyone like that? Jacob kept his face a mask of stone. Haven't seen anyone in weeks. Just me and my boys. Cole's gaze lingered on the cabin. That's so. Funny. We found a dead horse down by the river. Looked like it had been ridden hard. And there was a single set of footprints heading this direction before the snow covered him up. He leaned forward in his saddle. You wouldn't be lying to an old friend, would you, Jacob? We were never friends, Cole. Cole chuckled, a low, ugly sound. True enough. We were business associates, and I seem to recall you being very good at your job, finding things that were lost. You always did have a knack for it. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Mr. Thorne is offering a reward, a big one, for the girl and for what she took. I'm not interested. Cole's eyes narrowed. Maybe you should be. You know, it's a funny thing about your wife, Sarah. Always thought that Fever was a bit convenient. She was always asking questions, that one, sticking her nose where it didn't belong. A white-hot rage flared in Jacob's chest, so intense it almost buckled his knees. It wasn't a fever. The thought screamed through his mind. They killed her. They murdered his wife and told him it was a fever. He kept his voice level, but it cost him everything he had. You get on your horses and you ride away from my home, Cole. Cole's sneer widened. Or what? You'll shoot the three of us? You might get one, maybe two, but you won't get all of us. And your boys are in that cabin, aren't they? A fire spreads real fast in a dry log house. The threat was bare, brutal, and undeniable. He was trapped. Then one of Cole's men, a wiry man with a scar down his cheek, pointed toward the chicken coop. Hey, boss, look. A single small footprint was visible in a patch of snow the wind had cleared. It wasn't Jacob's boot print. It was smaller, much smaller, the kind of print a barefoot woman might leave. Cole's dead eyes lit up with triumph. He looked back at Jacob, his sneer turning into a predator's grin. Looks like you've got rats in your cellar, Rollins. The game was over. They knew she was here, and Jacob knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they weren't leaving without burning his entire world to the ground. Cole swung down from his horse, the leather of his saddle groaning in protest. Search the place, he ordered his men. Tear it apart if you have to. Stay out of my house, Cole, Jacob warned, raising the Winchester. The barrel was pointed right at Cole's chest. Cole just laughed. You don't have the stomach for it anymore, Rollins. You went soft. That wife of yours, she broke you, made you think you could be a decent man. He took a step closer, his hand dropping to the Colt peacemaker on his hip. Let me tell you a secret about decent men. They die first. Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger. The rage was a living thing inside him, begging to be let out. He could drop Cole right here, right now. But Cole was right. The other two men were already dismounting, rifles in their hands, their eyes on the cabin windows. On his sons. It was a trap, a kill box, and he was on the wrong side of it. Suddenly, a voice, clear and steady, came from the cabin door. Stop! It was Mara. She had come up from the cellar. She stood there, small and defiant, her face pale but her eyes blazing. Cole's grin was positively feral. Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in. We've been looking all over for you, little bird. Leave them alone, Mara said. This is about me, not them. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. What was she doing? It was a suicide play. Oh, it's about all of you now, Cole chuckled. You see, you made a mistake. You didn't just run, you ran to him. That makes him part of it. That makes him a traitor in Mr. Thorne's eyes. He looked back at Jacob. He's a forgiving man, Mr. Thorne. He's willing to overlook this lapse in judgment. All you have to do is give us the girl and the ledger. This was the choice. His life, his boys' lives, for hers. The old Jacob wouldn't have hesitated. He would have made the trade. Survived. That was always the goal. But looking at Mara, standing there willing to sacrifice herself for them, and thinking of Sarah, murdered for asking the same questions this woman had, something inside him snapped. The part of him that he thought Sarah had broken, the part he thought was soft, wasn't broken at all. It had been forged into something harder than steel. No, Jacob said. Cole's smile vanished. What did you say? I said no, Jacob repeated, his voice ringing with a finality that surprised even himself. You're not taking her, and you're not setting foot on my land. Turn around and ride out. This is your only warning. For a second, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the horses. Then Cole started to laugh, a full-throated, ugly roar. You really did lose your mind, Rollins. He drew his peacemaker. Wrong answer. But Jacob was faster. He wasn't aiming for Cole. He fired the Winchester, not at the man, but at the heavy lantern hanging from the corner of the porch. The bullet shattered the glass and flaming oil erupted, splashing across the dry wood of the porch railing. Flames shot up instantly, a roaring wall of fire between Jacob and Cole's men. Horses screamed and reared back from the heat. The two thugs scrambled for cover. In that split second of chaos, Jacob grabbed Mara's arm and yanked her back inside the cabin. The back window! Go! He slammed the door, the wood already hot from the spreading flames, and dropped the heavy bar across it. Gunshots exploded from outside, splintering the door. He turned and saw Mara helping the boys out the back window. Toby was already out, helping Will. Jacob scrambled after them, coughing as smoke began to fill the small cabin. They hit the snow and ran for the cover of the dense timberline. Behind them, their home, their sanctuary, was being consumed by fire. The crackle of the flames was punctuated by Cole's enraged screams. You'll pay for this, Rollins. You hear me? There's nowhere you can run. They plunged into the forest, the snow sucking at their boots. Jacob didn't look back. He had made his choice. He had declared war on Elias Thorne. He had thrown away his quiet life and his chance for safety. But as he ran, with Mara at his side and his boys just ahead, he felt something he hadn't felt in 4 long years. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was the cold, terrifying, and unmistakable feeling of being alive. The forest swallowed them whole. The thick canopy of the ancient pines blocked out the sky and muffled the sounds of their pursuers. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed, pushing deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. Jacob led them, his old instincts guiding their path. He didn't choose the easy way. He chose the hard way, through thick brush that tore at their clothes, over fallen logs slick with ice, across a half-frozen creek that numbed their feet to the bone. He was leaving a trail, he knew that, but he was making it a nightmare to follow. They finally stopped in a small, sheltered alcove of rock, hidden behind a curtain of snow-heavy branches. Will was sobbing quietly, his small body trembling from cold and fear. Toby was trying to be brave, but his face was chalky white. Mara knelt, pulling both boys close. It's okay, she whispered, her voice a calming balm in the frozen air. We're okay. Jacob stood watch, the Winchester held at the ready, his eyes scanning the trees, his ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The smell of smoke from their burning home still clung to his clothes. They murdered her, he said, his voice flat and dead. My wife. Mara looked up at him, her eyes full of a sorrow that matched his own. I'm sorry, Jacob. Sorry doesn't fix it, he bit back, the grief and rage a toxic brew in his gut. Cole as good as admitted it. She knew. She must have found out something about Thorne, and they silenced her. He slammed his fist against the rock face. And I believed their lies. I grieved and I hid, like a coward. You weren't a coward, Mara said softly. You were a father. You were protecting your sons. And now look where we are, he said, gesturing to their pathetic shelter, hiding in the woods with nothing but the clothes on our backs, hunted by my old boss. All because I didn't see what was right in front of my face. He finally looked at her, his gaze intense. That ledger you have, it's not just about money, is it? Mara shook her head, pulling the small book from her coat. It was damp, but intact. Thorne uses Cole and his men for more than just security. They're a death squad. When a miner makes a discovery on his own claim, they get a visit. The claim gets transferred to Thorne's company. The miner disappears. It's all in here. Dates, names, payments. He's not just a thief, Jacob. He's a serial killer, and he's been using his mining company as a cover for years. And Sarah had found out. It all clicked into place. His wife, the smart, inquisitive woman who never trusted Thorne, had uncovered his bloody secret. And he, her own husband, had been too blind to see it, too busy running from his own past to protect his own future. "There's an old trapper's cabin," Jacob said, his voice now cold and hard, the grief solidifying into a diamond point of purpose. "About 5 miles north of here. If we can make it there before they find our trail, we can rest. Make a plan." "And what's the plan, Jacob?" Mara asked. He looked from her to his sons, huddled together for warmth. He saw their terrified faces, and the image of Sarah's smiling face swam before his eyes. The plan was simple. It was brutal. It was the only way. "Thorne started this war when he killed my wife," he said, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. "You just gave me a reason to finish it." He wasn't running anymore. He was hunting, and Cole Renier and Elias Thorne were about to be reminded of the man Jacob Rollins used to be. The storm they had unleashed was about to turn back on them, and he was going to be the avalanche that buried them all. The trapper's cabin was more of a hovel, a one-room shack built into the side of a hill, barely visible under a heavy drift of snow. But the door was thick, the stone chimney was intact, and inside it was dry. There was even a small pile of firewood left by the last soul who'd passed through. It was a miracle. As Mara worked to get a small, smokeless fire going, Jacob stood outside using a pine branch to erase their tracks, to make it look like the wind had sculpted the snow around the cabin. It was an old trick, but it might buy them a few hours. Inside, the fire cast flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The boys were asleep, exhausted, huddled together under Jacob's heavy coat. Mara was tending to Will's foot, which he'd twisted in their desperate flight. She looked up as Jacob came in, shaking the snow from his shoulders. "How long do we have?" "Not long," he said. "Cole knows this country. He'll check every line cabin and shelter within 10 miles. By morning, he'll be here." She finished wrapping Will's ankle with a strip of cloth torn from her dress. "So we don't have a plan. We have a deadline." Jacob nodded, pulling the ledger from his coat. He opened it, his eyes scanning the neat columns of Mara's handwriting. Names, dates, payouts. It was a meticulous record of Thorne's evil. "This book is our only weapon," he said, "but it's useless out here. We need to get it to someone who can use it. A marshal, a judge." "The nearest federal marshal is in Stone Creek," Mara said. "That's 2 days' ride in good weather. We'd never make it on foot, not with the boys." "And Thorne owns the sheriff in Sundown Ridge," Jacob added. "We're boxed in." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the children. The situation was impossible. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of time. Then Mara's eyes lit up with a spark of an idea. "What about the tribes?" Jacob looked at her, confused. "What about them?" "Thorne isn't just killing miners," she explained, tapping a finger on a section of the ledger. "Look at these names. Black Eagle, Stone Hand. These are Apache lands he's mining on. The treaty is supposed to protect them, but Thorne is just erasing them. He's stealing their land, their gold, and their lives." A new, daring plan began to form in Jacob's mind. It was reckless. It was insane. It might get them all killed, but it was better than waiting here to be slaughtered. "The Apache have a winter camp," he thought aloud, "about a day's walk west of here, in the Red Canyon. They don't take kindly to trespassers, especially white men." "My mother was Apache," Mara said quietly. "My father was a white trader. I was never truly welcome in either world. But I know their language, I know their customs, and I have proof that this man, Thorne, has been murdering their people." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "They might not listen to a white man, but they might listen to a woman with Apache blood, carrying proof of the crimes against their kin." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. To the Apache, Jacob was an enemy, a settler on land that was once theirs. They had every reason to kill him on sight. But they also had every reason to want Elias Thorne wiped from the face of the earth. They're our only chance, Jacob said, his decision made. We leave at first light. We go to the Apache. He looked over at his sleeping boys, their innocent faces serene in the firelight. He was about to lead them into the heart of a territory that was hostile to its very core, to ask for help from people who had every right to hate him. He was betting his children's lives on the hope that a shared enemy could make for the strangest of allies. And as the wind howled outside their tiny shelter, Jacob knew that come sunrise, they wouldn't just be running from a blizzard of violence. They would be walking straight into the heart of a fire. The journey to the Red Canyon was a quiet, desperate march. The world was a canvas of white and gray, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Jacob took the lead, rifle in hand, his senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every shadow that moved, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Mara walked with the boys, her presence a steady, calming force. She told them stories in a low whisper, tales of clever coyotes and brave eagles, weaving a small bubble of magic to shield them from the cold, hard reality of their flight. They reached the edge of the canyon at dusk. It was a massive, bloody gash in the earth, the red rock walls stark against the white snow. Below, sheltered from the worst of the wind, Jacob could see the faint tendrils of smoke rising from the Apache camp. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "From here on, we do this your way." Mara nodded, her face set. "Wait here with the boys. I'll go down alone. They'll be on watch. If they see a man with a rifle, they'll shoot first. A lone woman, they might listen." Jacob's gut clenched. "It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous for all of us to walk in there," she countered. "Let me do this, Jacob." He looked into her eyes and saw a strength there that mirrored the ancient rock of the canyon itself. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He watched her make her way down the treacherous path, a small, solitary figure against the vast, hostile landscape. He found a defensible spot among the rocks, settling in with the boys. "Is she going to be okay, Pa?" Toby asked, his voice small. "She's the bravest person I've ever met," Jacob said, and he meant it. "She'll be fine." But he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince his son or himself. An hour passed, then two. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the canyon into a deep purple twilight. The temperature dropped. Every minute felt like an eternity. Jacob's mind raced with terrible possibilities. What if they didn't believe her? What if they took her prisoner? What if he just sent her to her death? Just as he was about to break his promise and go after her, he saw movement on the path below. Two figures were climbing towards them. One was Mara, the other was a tall, imposing Apache warrior, his face stern, a rifle held loosely in his hands. Jacob raised his own rifle, his heart pounding. "It's all right," Mara called out. "He is Kyle. He will take us to their chief." Kyle's dark eyes studied Jacob with an unnerving intensity as they approached. He looked at the rifle, at the boys, and then his gaze settled on Jacob's face. He said nothing. They were led down into the camp. It was larger than Jacob expected, a collection of hide lodges nestled in the canyon floor. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Faces peered out at them as they passed, suspicious and unwelcoming. They were brought to the largest lodge, and the flap was pulled aside. Inside, an old man sat by the fire. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes sharp and intelligent. This was the chief, a man named Jaron. Mara spoke to him in the Apache language, her voice respectful but firm. She held out the ledger. Jaron took it, handling it like a strange foreign object. Mara pointed to the names, her finger tracing the entries, explaining what they meant. As she spoke, Jaron's expression grew darker and darker. Kyle, standing behind the chief, let out a low growl of anger. When Mara was finished, a heavy silence fell over the lodge. Jaron looked up, his piercing eyes locking onto Jacob. He spoke in perfect, accented English. "This book contains much evil. The man Thorn is a snake who has poisoned our lands for too long." He paused. "But you are a white man. Your people have brought us nothing but broken promises and death. Why should we help you?" It was the question Jacob had been dreading. There was no good answer. "Because this man killed my wife," Jacob said, his voice raw. and he will kill my sons. My fight with him is now your fight. I don't ask for your friendship. I don't ask for you to forget what my people have done. I ask for you to help me kill the man who is killing both of us." Geron studied him for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at the ledger, at Mara, and at the two small, shivering boys huddled near the fire. Finally, he nodded slowly. "The snake has bitten you both. It is right that you should crush its head together." He looked at Kel. "Cole Renair and his men will have followed their trail. They will be at the canyon rim by morning." Then he looked back at Jacob, and for the first time, there was a glint of something other than suspicion in his eyes. It was the grim understanding of a fellow warrior. "Tomorrow," the old chief said, "we will give them a war they will not forget." The alliance was forged, but standing in that lodge, surrounded by men who had every reason to be his enemy, Jacob knew that surviving the next 24 hours would be harder than anything he had ever done in his life. The battle for their lives was about to begin. Dawn broke cold and sharp over the rim of the Red Canyon. Jacob stood beside Cale on a high ledge, looking down at the narrow trail that was the only easy way in. Below, the Apache warriors moved like ghosts through the rocks and scrub, melting into the landscape, becoming part of the canyon itself. They were armed with rifles, bows, and a cold, patient fury. Jacob had never seen anything like it. This wasn't a mob. This was a finely tuned instrument of death. "They are coming," Kyle said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking. He was listening. A moment later, Jacob saw them. Cole Renair and his two men, riding single file down the treacherous path, their faces grim with determination. They were confident, arrogant. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they had just walked into the spider's web. "Geron has given the order," Cal said. "No one fires until they reach the canyon floor. We will seal the exit. There will be no escape." Jacob nodded, his knuckles white around the stock of his Winchester. He'd left Mara and the boys with the women and children in the deepest part of the camp, guarded and safe. This was his fight now, his and the Apaches. The weight was agonizing. He watched Cole's slow descent, every instinct screaming at him to raise his rifle and end it now. But he held his ground. This needed to be a message. This needed to be an extermination. When Cole and his men finally reached the flat, open ground of the canyon floor, a single, high-pitched cry echoed from the cliffs. The signal. It was answered by a volley of arrows from above. They rained down with a terrifying thump, 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 embedding themselves in the ground around the riders. One of Cole's men screamed as an arrow punched through his thigh, pinning him to his saddle. His horse shrieked, bucking wildly. Gunshots erupted from all sides. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, kicking up dust. Cole's men were completely exposed, caught in a perfectly executed crossfire. The second man was knocked from his saddle before he could even draw his weapon. A rifle shot from the cliffs, hitting him square in the chest. Cole, however, was a survivor. He threw himself from his horse, rolling behind a small boulder, his peacemaker already in his hand, firing blindly up at the rocks. "Rollins!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the canyon. "I know you're here, you coward! Face me!" Jacob didn't answer. This wasn't a duel. This was an execution. But Cole was smart. He knew he couldn't stay pinned down. He broke cover, running in a low crouch towards the rockfall at the base of the cliff, seeking better shelter. And he was running directly towards Jacob's position. "He is yours," Kel said, not moving. "This is your justice." Jacob sighted down the barrel of the Winchester. He had Cole dead to rights. A clean shot. It would all be over. He thought of Sarah, of the 4 years of lies, of his burning home. His finger tightened on the trigger. But it felt too easy, too clean for the man who had destroyed his life. He lowered the rifle. "No," he said to Kyle, "not like this." He stood up from behind the rocks, in full view of Cole. "Renair!" he yelled, his voice a raw command. "You wanted me? Here I am." Cole skidded to a halt, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. Then it twisted into a hateful grin. He raised his peacemaker, but before he could fire, Jacob threw his own rifle to the ground. He drew the heavy hunting knife from his belt. "No guns, Cole," Jacob shouted, his voice echoing in the sudden, ringing silence as the Apaches ceased their firing. Just you and me, the way it should have been 4 years ago. Cole stared, first at Jacob, then at the silent, watching warriors on the cliffs. He was still surrounded, but he was a man driven by ego and violence. The chance to kill Jacob with his own hands was too much to resist. He laughed, a crazed, wild sound. He tossed his own pistol aside. "You're a dead man, Rollins," he charged. Jacob met him head on. It wasn't a fight. It was a collision. They crashed together, grunting, fists flying. It was brutal, clumsy, and raw. Cole was bigger, stronger, but Jacob was fueled by a righteous fire that had been smoldering for 4 years. He fought for Sarah. He fought for his boys. He fought for Mara. They rolled in the dust, trading blows. Cole got his hands around Jacob's throat, squeezing, his face purple with rage. Jacob's vision started to spot. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he brought his knee up hard into Cole's side. The big man grunted, his grip loosening just enough for Jacob to twist away, gasping for air. He scrambled to his feet. Cole came at him again, but this time he was slower. He was hurt. Jacob didn't hesitate. He lunged, not with his fists, but with his whole body, driving his shoulder into Cole's chest. The big man staggered backward, tripped, and fell. His head hit one of the canyon rocks with a sickening crack. He didn't move again. Silence descended on the canyon. The battle was over. Jacob stood over Cole's body, his chest heaving, his body screaming in pain. He had won. He had gotten his justice for Sarah. But as he looked up at the silent Apache warriors watching him from the cliffs, he knew this was only the beginning. He had killed the rabid dog. Now he had to go after its master. The return to Sundown Ridge wasn't a stealthy infiltration. It was a declaration. Jacob rode at the head of a column of 20 Apache warriors, Cale at his side. They rode not as fugitives, but as avengers. Mar and the boys were safe in the Red Canyon, under the protection of Chief Geron. This last part was his to finish. They arrived at the edge of town as the sun was setting, painting the dirty streets in shades of orange and blood. The townsfolk, the ones who had turned a blind eye to Thorne's reign of terror for years, scattered like rats, their faces filled with fear. They had never seen the Apache ride into town like this. Not in force, not with a white man leading them. They rode straight to the saloon, the biggest building in town, the one Thorne used as his personal fortress. Jacob swung down from his horse, the ledger tucked into his belt. Cale and the warriors fanned out, forming a silent, deadly perimeter. No one was getting in. No one was getting out. Jacob kicked the saloon doors open. The place went silent. The tinny piano music died. Elias Thorne was sitting at a back table, playing cards with the town's corrupt sheriff. He looked up, and for a moment, his calm, arrogant demeanor faltered. He saw Jacob, bruised and bloodied but standing tall, and he saw the stony-faced Apache warriors visible through the doors behind him. "Rollins," Thorne said, recovering quickly, his voice smooth as poison, "to what do I owe the pleasure? I see you've made some new friends." "I'm here to collect a debt, Thorne," Jacob said, his voice carrying across the silent room. He walked forward, stopping at the table. The sheriff, a fat man with beady eyes, started to stand up, his hand going for his gun. "I wouldn't," Cal said from the doorway, the hammer of his rifle clicking back with ominous clarity. The sheriff froze, then slowly sat back down, sweating. Jacob pulled the ledger from his belt and tossed it onto the card table. "It's over." Thorne glanced at the book, then back at Jacob, a thin smile playing on his lips. "A book? Is that what this is about? Some numbers in a book?" "This town understands money and power, Jacob. Not ink on a page." He leaned back, confident. "You have no proof." "That book is your confession," Jacob said, "and I am the witness." He looked around the room at the miners and merchants who had lived under Thorne's thumb. "You all know what he is. You know about the men who have disappeared, the claims that were stolen." No one moved. Their fear of Thorne was still stronger than their courage. "They won't help you," Thorne sneered. "They don't have to," Jacob replied. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a telegram. "Before we rode here, one of Geron's men rode to Stone Creek. He gave this to the U.S. Marshal. It explains everything. It tells him about the ledger, about the murders. It tells him that the Apache Nation is formally accusing you of breaking the treaty and murdering their people." Thorne's face went pale. This wasn't about a local sheriff anymore. This was the federal government. This was the U.S. Army. The marshal and a company of cavalry will be here in 2 days, Jacob said, his voice cold as a grave. They're coming to arrest you for murder, Thorne. For all of them. For the miners. For the Apache. And for my wife. Thorne's composure finally shattered, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. In one swift movement, he flipped the table, drew a hidden derringer from his sleeve, and fired. But Jacob was ready. He dove to the side as the small pistol cracked. The bullet whistled past his ear. Before Thorne could fire again, an arrow sliced through the air from the doorway and embedded itself deep in his shoulder. He screamed, dropping the gun. Cale stood there, his bow still raised. It was over. Jacob walked over to where Thorne was writhing on the floor, clutching his shoulder. He knelt down, his face inches from the man who had taken everything from him. "You're right," Jacob whispered, his voice filled with ice. "This town understands power." He stood up and looked at the Apache warriors now filing into the room. "And you have none left." They left him there, bleeding on the floor of his own saloon, surrounded by the silent townspeople, who were finally, after years of terror, seeing the monster for what he was. A weak, pathetic man whose empire had crumbled to dust. As Jacob rode out of town, with the Apache at his back, he didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel joy. He just felt quiet. The storm was over. The ghosts were finally at peace. He was going home, back to the Red Canyon, back to Mara, back to his sons. His real life was just beginning. The cabin wasn't rebuilt in a day. It took the rest of the winter and into the spring thaw. But Jacob didn't build it alone. On the day the U.S. Marshals rode into Sundown Ridge and took a whimpering Elias Thorne away in chains, Chief Geron and 20 of his men rode back to the charred remains of the Rollins Ranch. They didn't come as warriors, they came as builders. They worked side by side, Apache and white man, raising new walls from fresh-cut pine. They spoke little, but there was a deep, unspoken understanding between them. They had shed blood together. Now they would build a future together. Mara was the heart of it all. She directed the work, her quiet competence earning the respect of the stoic Apache warriors and the admiration of Jacob. She worked as hard as any man, chinking the logs with mud and moss, her hands never still. The boys, Toby and Will, were her shadows, their laughter a sound that Jacob had thought was lost to him forever. They were healing. They were all healing. When the new cabin was finished, it was stronger than the old one. It had a new room built onto the side, a room with a wide window that looked out over the valley. It was Mara's room. One evening, as the first green shoots of spring pushed through the last of the snow, Jacob found Mara standing by that window, looking out at the sunset. He came and stood beside her. For a long time, they just watched the colors bleed across the sky. "I never thanked you," he said finally, his voice low. She turned to him, a small, soft smile on her lips. "What for?" "For showing up in the storm," he said. "You saved us, Mara, in more ways than one." "We saved each other," she replied, her eyes searching his. The space between them was no longer filled with secrets and fear. It was filled with something new, something warm and fragile, but growing stronger every day. He thought of his first wife, Sarah, and the love he had for her. This was different. It wasn't a replacement. It was a continuation, a new chapter, written on a clean page. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers laced with his, a perfect fit. "I was wrong about the silence," he said. "I thought it meant safety, but a home isn't supposed to be silent." Will and Toby ran into the room then, their faces flushed from playing outside. Will launched himself into Mara's arms, and Toby leaned against Jacob, telling him about a hawk he had seen. The little cabin was filled with noise, with life, with the chaotic, beautiful sound of a family. Jacob looked at Mara, her arms wrapped around his youngest son, her eyes shining in the twilight. He was home. The storm was over, and for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't afraid of the ghosts, because the love that filled this new house was bright enough to chase all the shadows away. Some stories are about revenge, but the best ones, the ones that stick with you, are about what comes after. They're about rebuilding, about finding the courage to let someone in after the storm has taken everything. Jacob Rollins thought his life was over the day he buried his wife, but he was wrong. It was just waiting for the right person to knock on his door. It just goes to show you, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is open your heart. And sometimes it's the only thing that can save you. If you enjoyed this story of justice and new beginnings, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more tales from the frontier, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thanks for listening.